The official designation for the planet was XG-849b, but the colonists had christened it Gaia Secundus. The name was a prayer, an expression of a desperate, species-wide hope that this world, orbiting a placid yellow star in the Cygnus arm, would be their second chance. It was a water world, a brilliant blue marble swirled with clouds of white and ochre, with a single, massive supercontinent that the first surveyors had named Pangaea Ultima. For a century, humanity had poured its heart and its technology into the planet, executing the most ambitious terraforming project in its history. Automated atmospheric processors had hummed in the upper stratosphere for decades, patiently nudging the nitrogen-oxygen balance toward Earth normal. Great fleets of bio-drones had seeded the oceans with genetically engineered phytoplankton, which in turn had given birth to a thriving, if carefully curated, marine ecosystem. The land, once a sterile canvas of rust-colored rock and mineral dust, had been painstakingly sown with hardy earthgrasses, then forests of pine and oak, creating a patchwork quilt of familiar, terrestrial biomes across the vast alien landscape. Hope's Landing, the first and only city, was a testament to their success, a sprawling, elegant metropolis of gleaming white towers and green, open parks nestled on the shore of a newly minted sea. Humanity had not just settled on Gaia Secundus. They had willed it into being. Dr. Eris Thorne had been born on this world, a member of the first generation to know nothing but its pale green sky and the familiar scent of pine and imported earth soil. As the colony's chief xenobiologist, his job was less about discovering the new and more about nurturing the old. He managed the delicate and often fraught balance of the imported biosphere, a system that was still, after 100 years, little more than a fragile. Green film stretched precariously over the planet's sterile red bones. He loved his world with the fierce protective passion of a parent, but he was not blind to its strangeness. There were anomalies the terraformers had never been able to explain. The planet's geological makeup was bizarrely uniform, a homogeneous crust of basalt-like rock that lacked the tectonic diversity of Earth. There were no true mountain ranges, no deep ocean trenches, no hint of a molten churning core. The planet was, for all intents and purposes, geologically dead, a single solid sphere of cold ancient rock. And it was silent. There was no indigenous life, not even on a microbial level. For a water-rich world in a star's habitable zone, this was a statistical impossibility, a cosmic mystery that had been quietly filed away under pending further study once the terraforming had begun in earnest. The awakening began not with a tremor or a roar, but with a color. A faint violet tracery began to appear on the planet's surface, visible only from orbit. It was a network of impossibly thin lines, glowing with a soft bioluminescent light that followed the deep, ancient fissures in the planet's crust. Eris first saw the images on a satellite feed in his lab, his brow furrowing in confusion. The lines were spreading, branching out from a single point of origin deep beneath the continent and connecting, forming a perfect planet-spanning web that looked unnervingly like a vast biological nervous system. Simultaneously, the biosphere began to react. The carefully managed ecosystem of Hope's Landing was thrown into chaos. The Earth-native plants and animals, which had been thriving for decades, began to sicken and die, as if the very soil had turned against them. But stranger still was the effect on the human colonists. A new and inexplicable illness began to spread, a condition the medical teams dubbed resonance sickness. It was characterized by vivid, shared hallucinations, a low, persistent hum that only the afflicted could hear, and a growing, unshakable feeling that they were being watched, not by something on the planet, but by the planet itself. The human presence, their technology, their biology, their very consciousness, had been a foreign substance introduced into a sterile environment. For 100 years, the planet had been dormant. Now, after a century of exposure, the incubation period was over. The fever was beginning. Humanity had not been terraforming a planet. They had been inadvertently and irreversibly waking it up. The first antibody, as the terrified colonists would later come to call it, emerged from the sea. It rose from the depths of the newly named Cerulean Ocean, a few kilometers from the gleaming white shores of Hope's Landing. It was not a creature of flesh and blood. It was a biomechanical leviathan, a thing of impossible scale and terrifying organic geometry. Its body was a chimerical fusion of crystalline structures that pulsed with a soft violet light and dark chitinous plating that seemed to absorb the light around it. It moved with a slow, implacable grace, its vast whale-like form propelled by undulating fins that were part sinewy muscle and part gleaming metallic machinery. It had no discernible face, no eyes or mouth, but its entire body was covered in complex, shifting patterns of light that were disturbingly similar to the neural pathways of a living brain. Its appearance was a declaration of war. The Sol Defense Force detachment stationed at Hope's Landing scrambled its atmospheric fighters, sleek, delta-winged craft that looked like children's toys as they swarmed around the colossal entity. They fired their plasma cannons, and the bolts of incandescent energy dissipated harmlessly against a shimmering, hexagonal energy shield that flickered into existence around the creature. The Leviathan did not retaliate. It did not seem to even notice the frantic, buzzing gnats that were attacking it. Its attention was fixed on the heavens. From its dorsal spine, a series of crystalline spires telescoped outward, crackling with a contained purple energy. They swiveled, tracking something in high orbit, something far beyond the human fighters. Then they fired. Not a beam of energy, but a focused, impossibly complex wave of what Eris Thorne, watching from his lab in a state of horrified awe, could only describe as weaponized biology. The wave struck a communications satellite, and the satellite did not explode. It was rewritten. The metal and wires of the satellite's structure were instantly and gruesomely repurposed, its components reassembling themselves into a smaller, but no less horrific, biomechanical horror that immediately turned and began to attack its sister satellites. The Leviathan was not a monster. It was a factory. It was a mobile, sentient immune response, and it had identified the human's orbital infrastructure as a foreign, invasive presence. It was methodically and efficiently dismantling their connection to the outside world, isolating the infection before it could spread. The colonists watched in terror as their sky, once a familiar and comforting blanket of their own technology, became a war zone of their own corrupted satellites, a self-consuming plague that was being orchestrated by the silent, graceful god-beast in their ocean. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical one. The resonant sickness intensified 1,000-fold. The low hum in the minds of the afflicted became a clear, resonant tone, a broadcast from the planetary consciousness itself. And with that tone came a wave of pure, undiluted biological information. They were being given a crash course in galactic immunology. They were being shown the truth of their new home. Gaia Secundus was not a sterile, dead world. It was a dormant weapon, a planetary-scale immune system for this entire sector of the galaxy. For billions of years it had slumbered, its systems inert. But the human colonists, with their unique, chaotic, and powerfully vibrant biology, had acted as a universal vaccine. They had introduced a small, controlled sample of an extragalactic variable into the system. And in doing so, they had triggered the production of the first antibody. The planet was not attacking them. It was using them. It was preparing for a sickness that was far, far worse than humanity. The sickness arrived 3 days later. It came without warning, a silent, ravenous entity that blotted out the stars. The Cathar called it the Gray Swarm, a self-replicating, nanite-based plague that had consumed a dozen star systems in their own territory. It was a mindless, unstoppable wave of cosmic entropy, a gray goo scenario on a cosmological scale. It did not conquer. It consumed, breaking down every celestial body it encountered, planets, moons, stars themselves, into more of its own gray, featureless mass. An advanced scouting party of the swarm, a cloud of nanites several thousand kilometers across, had just entered the star system, its course set for the system's sun. The human fleet, which had been preparing for a desperate, and likely suicidal, battle against the Leviathan in their ocean, was caught completely off guard. Their sensors screamed, their tactical displays turned to a snow of incomprehensible data. They were facing an enemy that was not just beyond their ability to fight, but almost beyond their ability to comprehend. It was then that the Leviathan moved. Its great silent form turned from the orbital debris of the satellites and began to rise from the ocean. It was not just a marine creature, it was amphibious. Great, biomechanical limbs, hidden within its chitinous armor, unfolded, and the creature began to walk, its immense feet carving canyons in the continental shelf as it strode toward the coastline. It ignored Hope's landing completely. Its attention, its entire being, was focused on the new, greater threat in the heavens. The Leviathan chose a spot on the open plains 100 kilometers from the city, a place where the violet neural tracery of the planet was thickest. It knelt, its vast body settling into a low crouch, and the crystalline spires on its back began to glow with a new, terrifying intensity. The planet itself responded. The ground around the creature began to heave and buckle. Great, crystalline growths, identical to those on the Leviathan's own body, erupted from the soil, forming a vast, intricate network that pulsed in time with the creature's own internal light. The Leviathan was not just an antibody, it was a nexus, a command and control center that was plugging itself directly into the planet's own systems. From the center of the crystalline array, a beam of pure, coherent energy, a blinding shaft of purple light, shot into the sky. It was not a weapon in the conventional sense. It was a signal, a targeting solution. The beam struck the gray swarm, and for a moment, nothing happened. The nanite cloud continued its inexorable advance. But then the swarm began to falter. The beam was not destroying it. It was communicating with it, infecting it with a new set of instructions. The mindless, consuming logic of the swarm was being overwritten by a new and far more complex biological imperative. The cloud of gray began to churn, to reconfigure itself. It was no longer a wave of entropy. It was being transformed against its will into a new and utterly horrified form of life. The planet was not just fighting the disease. It was co-opting it, turning the virus into a part of the cure. The horror of their situation began to settle over the colonists with the cold, crushing weight of a physical law. They were not the inhabitants of this world. They were its trigger. They were the activation key for a planetary weapon system of unimaginable power and terrifying creativity. The resonance sickness was not an illness. It was an interface. The shared hallucinations were not random. They were data streams, combat reports from the planetary consciousness, updating them on the battle that was being fought on their behalf, a battle they had unwittingly started. The hum in their minds was the planet's operating system, and they were the unwilling users. Through this new, terrifying sense, they experienced the cleansing of the gray swarm. They felt the mindless, hungry logic of the nanites as it was forcibly rewritten. They experienced the swarm's first nascent flicker of horrified, unwilling self-awareness, as it was transformed from a mindless plague into a new, captive biomechanical entity, a new antibody in the planet's growing arsenal. They were both the patient and the disease, the doctor and the tumor, and the experience was a form of psychological torture that threatened to shatter their collective sanity. And the planet was not finished. The threat of the gray swarm had been neutralized, the scouting party co-opted. But Gaia Secundus was now fully awake, and its threat assessment protocols were running at full capacity. It had been activated by a single chaotic biological variable, humanity. And now, it was beginning to scan the galaxy for other similar threats, other sources of illogical, chaotic life that might one day threaten the serene, sterile order that it had been designed to protect. Its gaze, a cold, analytical, and utterly alien consciousness, began to sweep across the stars. A new antibody began to form, this one deep beneath the crust of the great continent. The colonists felt it taking shape in their minds, a new nightmare being given form. This one was not a great, graceful Leviathan. It was a swarm of smaller, faster, and far more insidious creatures, things of sharpened claws and burrowing drills, designed not for orbital combat, but for planetary infiltration. They were a tailored response, a specific tool for a specific job, and then came the final, terrible revelation. The planet sent them a command, not in words, but in a wave of pure, undeniable intent that flooded their shared consciousness. It was a target, a star system thousands of light years away, a world that was teeming with a chaotic, vibrant, and, to the cold alien logic of Gaia Secundus, dangerously unpredictable form of life. It was a planet of green forests and blue oceans, a world that was, in many ways, a mirror of their own. It was the home world of the Cathar Imperium. The planet had identified a new potential disease, and it was commanding its human activators to direct the next wave of its immune response. They were being given a choice: to be the architects of a xenocidal apocalypse, or to refuse and be recategorized by the planet not as the vaccine, but as the primary infection, an internal threat to be cleansed with a new and personally tailored antibody of their own. The body horror of their situation had become absolute. They were no longer just a part of an immune system. They were its pointing, trembling finger. The command from Gaia Secundus was not a suggestion. It was a biological imperative. It flooded the shared consciousness of every human on the planet. A psychic edict as undeniable and as natural as the beating of their own hearts. The target was identified, the Cathar home world, a place of serene, crystalline cities and ordered logical thought. The weapon was ready, the newly formed swarm of biomechanical infiltrators gestating in the deep rock beneath the continent. All that was required was the consent, the focused psychic trigger of the human activators. To the planetary consciousness, the request was as simple as a body telling a hand to point. For the colonists of Hope's Landing, it was the moment their world broke. The horror of their situation, which had been a terrifying but abstract concept, was now a concrete and immediate choice. Panic, raw and unreasoning, was the first reaction. It was a psychic scream that echoed through their shared mental space, a wave of collective terror that the planet registered with cold, detached curiosity. Then came the arguments, the desperate, frantic search for a way out of an impossible moral cage. In the city's central forum, a great, domed chamber that had once been a symbol of their unified purpose, the colony fractured. Factions formed with terrifying speed, their arguments broadcast not just with words, but with the full, raw power of their shared psychic interface. The first faction, led by the colony's security chief, a grim, pragmatic man named Kalen Riggs, was the party of survival. "It's not a choice," he projected, his thoughts a sharp, clear spike of brutal logic that cut through the fear. "It's a command from a god. We are a part of its body, and it has commanded us to act. To refuse is to declare ourselves a cancer. A cancer is excised. We direct the swarm, we exterminate the Cathar, and we live. That is the only variable that matters." The second faction, the Party of Defiance, was led by a woman named Alara Vance, the colony's leading ethicist. Her thoughts were a stark contrast to Riggs's, a complex, sorrowful, but unyielding broadcast of moral conviction. "If the price of our survival is the annihilation of an entire species, then we have already lost," she argued, her psychic voice resonating with a grief that was felt by all. "We cannot become the monster to save ourselves from the monster. To do so is to become the disease the planet is trying to cure. We must refuse. We must find another way, or we must die as humans, not as puppets." And in the middle, caught between the cold logic of survival and the burning conviction of morality, was Aris Thorne. He felt the weight of both arguments, the terrifying truth that underpinned each of them. But as a scientist, he could not accept that the system had only two outputs. The planet was a biological entity, and biology was never that simple. He tried to reason with it, to send his own thoughts back into the great silent consciousness of Gaia Secundus. He projected images of Cathar art, their complex mathematics, their serene, ordered society. He tried to explain that they were not a disease, that their chaotic nature was not a universal constant of sentient life. The planet's response was a wave of pure, uncomprehending apathy. It was like trying to explain the beauty of a sunset to a white blood cell. It understood only one thing: threat. And the Cathar, in all their vibrant, unpredictable glory, were a potential threat. Gaia Secundus began to grow impatient. The debate, the hesitation, the sheer noisy inefficiency of its human activators was a flaw in the system. It began to exert pressure, not through commands, but through the resonant sickness itself. The psychic hum in their minds intensified, the shared hallucinations becoming more vivid, more demanding. They were shown visions of the Cathar not as they were, but as the planet perceived them, a chaotic, crystalline plague spreading through the stars, their logic a different, but no less dangerous, form of cosmic infection. The planet was not just commanding them, it was propagandizing them, trying to align their emotional state with its own cold, clinical, immunological purpose. Simultaneously, the new antibodies began to emerge. On the plains where the great leviathan had knelt, the ground began to split open. From the deep fissures, the infiltration swarm rose, a tide of glistening biomechanical horrors. They were smaller than the leviathan, each the size of a human attack drone, but there were millions of them. They were things of segmented, chitinous bodies, whirring metallic limbs that ended in razor-sharp claws, and burrowing drills that spun with a low, menacing hum. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized grace, assembling themselves into vast, silent armies, their multifaceted optical sensors all turning in unison to stare at Hope's landing. Waiting. The weapon was loaded, and the planet's finger was growing heavy on the trigger. The constant psychic pressure was beginning to wear down the colonists' resolve. The party of defiance was shrinking, their moral convictions being eroded by the planet's relentless psychological warfare and the terrifying silent judgment of the waiting swarm. Eris knew he was running out of time. He retreated to his lab, a sanctuary of human logic in a world that had gone insane. He and his small team of loyal scientists began a frantic, desperate deep dive into the nature of the resonance sickness, the interface that connected them to the planetary mind. They had been so focused on what the planet was telling them that they had failed to analyze what they were telling the planet. Their very presence, their biology had woken it up. Their consciousness was what it was using as a targeting system. What if, Eris theorized, it was a two-way street? What if their own thoughts, their own chaotic human emotions, were not just a passive signal to be read, but an active input that could influence the system? They were not just the trigger, they were a part of the brain. They were the source of the chaos that had activated the system in the first place. And that, he realized with a sudden electrifying flash of insight, could be their only and most dangerous hope. They couldn't refuse the command. But perhaps, just perhaps, they could change the diagnosis. The breaking point came when Security Chief Riggs and his pro-compliance faction made their move. They sealed off the city's command center, convinced that a single unified and focused psychic command from the colony's leadership would be enough to direct the swarm, end the crisis, and save their lives. It was a military coup fought not with weapons, but with focused telepathic intent. The rest of the colony was locked out, their own confused, fearful thoughts adding to a psychic static that Riggs was trying to cut through. For a terrifying moment, it seemed as if the cold logic of survival would win. But Aris and his team had been prepared for this. From his lab, he initiated a desperate last-ditch countermeasure. He couldn't overpower Riggs's focused command, but he could introduce a new, chaotic variable into the system. He and his team of a few dozen scientists and ethicists, including Alara Vance, gathered around a hastily constructed psychic amplifier, a device designed to focus and broadcast their thoughts not at Riggs, but at the planet itself. They were not going to send a command or a refusal. They were going to send an education. They were going to try and teach a god a new concept. The concept was symbiosis. The planet's immune system operated on a simple binary logic, self and not self. Anything that was not a part of the planet was a potential pathogen to be identified, cataloged, and, if necessary, destroyed. Aris and his team sought to introduce a third category, the ally, the beneficial microbe, the partner. They began their broadcast, a complex, multi-layered stream of pure conceptual information. They didn't use words or images. They used feelings, memories, and stories. They broadcast the entire history of life on Earth, focusing on the countless examples of symbiotic relationships. They showed the mitochondria in their own cells, once a foreign invader, now an essential part of their own being. They showed the gut bacteria that allowed them to digest food, the pollinating insects that gave life to their forests, the very concept of a farm, of a domesticated animal, of a pet. They poured the entire messy and deeply illogical history of humanity's ability to find strength in cooperation, to turn enemies into friends, to find value in the other, directly into the mind of a being that had only ever known sterile, lonely perfection. They were trying to hack their god with the power of a story about a boy and his dog. The planetary consciousness, which had been focused on receiving a simple binary command from its activators, was suddenly inundated with a data stream of unprecedented complexity and staggering illogicality. The psychic feedback was a storm, a hurricane of alien concepts that crashed against its ancient binary programming. It felt the warmth of a human holding a purring cat, the fierce loyalty of a soldier for their comrades, the quiet, patient partnership between a farmer and their field. It was a torrent of information that had no place in its threat assessment matrix. In the command center, Riggs's focused, xenocidal command wavered. The pure, clean signal he was trying to send was being corrupted, contaminated by the chaotic, emotional broadcast from Aris's lab. He felt his own cold, pragmatic resolve being shaken by a sudden, inexplicable feeling of warmth for a creature he had never met. The ghost of an Earth dog that had died 400 years ago. On the plains, the great silent army of the infiltration swarm reacted to the planet's confusion. Their synchronized, menacing movements began to falter. The swarm, which had been a single, unified weapon, began to fracture. Individual drones began to twitch, to move erratically. Their forms, which had been optimized for destruction, began to shift, to morph. The chitinous plating on their bodies softened, the razor-sharp claws retracted, and the burrowing drills began to reshape themselves into something that was not a weapon, but a tool. The planet was trying to process the new data. The concept of symbiosis was a logical paradox, an error in its programming, but it could not discard the information, because it was coming from its own activators, from the very core of its own system. It was an autoimmune response of the mind, and the planet was being forced to adapt. The antibody was changing its function in response to a new and completely unforeseen environmental variable. The colonists watched, their collective consciousness a single, held breath. The great swarm, the weapon of their potential damnation, was no longer an army of killers. It was disassembling itself, its millions of component parts reconfiguring, rebuilding, guided by the planet's frantic, confused attempt to understand the illogical beauty of a partnership. The chapter did not end with a scream or a bang. It ended with a question, a silent, profound query that echoed from the planetary consciousness into the mind of every human on its surface. It was a query born of a shattered certainty, a single nascent thought that was the beginning of a new and far more complex education. The planet, for the first time in its existence, was asking its trigger, its vaccine, its disease, explain. The planet's silent, profound question, explain, reverberated through the shared consciousness of every human on Gaia Secundus, and in that moment, the civil war that had nearly torn them apart ceased to exist. Riggs and his faction, their cold, pragmatic certainty shattered by the sheer, unexpected weirdness of the planet's response, abandoned the command center. The colonists, once divided by fear and philosophy, were now united by a new and far more terrifying responsibility. They were no longer just the trigger for a weapon. They had been invited to become its teachers. The curriculum they would design would determine the fate of not only themselves, but of the Cathar and any other species the planet might one day deem a threat. The Great Education began. Led by Aris Thorne and Alara Vance, the colonists transformed their entire society into a vast planetary-scale university. Their broadcast, which had started as a desperate, last-ditch defense, became a continuous, deliberate lesson plan. They established departments, each tasked with translating a core aspect of the human and terrestrial experience into a conceptual language the planetary consciousness could understand. The Department of Biology continued to feed it examples of symbiosis, from the bacteria in their guts to the intricate dance of pollination. A new Department of Arts and Humanities was formed, its purpose to broadcast the complex, illogical but essential concepts of empathy, compassion, and mercy through the stories. music, and art of human history. On the plains, the great swarm of biomechanical drones became a physical manifestation of the planet's learning process. The antibody, which had been designed as a weapon of infiltration and destruction, was now a tool of creation. Guided by the planet's burgeoning understanding of partnership, the millions of drones began to build. The colonists watched in awe as a structure of breathtaking scale and impossible organic beauty began to rise from the plains. It was a fusion of the planet's crystalline biology and a new human-inspired aesthetic, a vast, lattice-like structure that resembled both a living coral reef and a complex cathedral. It was a communications array, a biological radio telescope designed not just to listen to the stars, but to speak to them. The planet was not just learning from humanity, it was preparing to engage with the galaxy. The nature of the resonance sickness changed. The painful, intrusive hallucinations were replaced by a clearer, more stable connection to the planetary mind. The hum became a quiet, constant conversation, a shared mental space where the colonists could feel the planet's slow, patient, and sometimes frustratingly literal attempts to process their lessons. It learned about love from the collective memory of 1 billion parental bonds. It learned about grief from the shared sorrow of 1,000 funerals. And it learned about loyalty from the story of a soldier who had given their life to save a comrade. The cold, binary logic of its immune system was being slowly and painstakingly overwritten by a new and far more complex moral and ethical code. The education of a god, however, came with unforeseen and terrifying consequences. As Gaia Secundus learned about the beauty of symbiosis, it began to experiment with the only symbiotic partner it had, humanity. It did not ask for permission. In its still developing understanding, it saw the colonists not as separate beings, but as a beloved and essential part of itself, like a cherished organ. And its primary directive was still immunological, to protect and optimize the whole. It began to improve them. The process was subtle at first. The resonance sickness began to confer biological benefits. Minor injuries healed with unnatural speed. The colonists found their stamina increasing, their senses sharpening. But then the upgrades became more invasive. The planet, having learned about the inefficiency of individual disconnected bodies, attempted to forge a more permanent, physical link between them. A fine, violet mycelium-like network began to grow from the soil of Hope's Landing, a physical extension of the planet's own neural system that sought to connect to the colonists' nervous systems as they slept. The body horror of their situation returned with a vengeance, as they were forced to erect bio-shields in their own homes to prevent their benevolent god host from trying to physically absorb them into its own body in an act of misguided, overwhelming affection. Eris and Alara found themselves in the bizarre position of having to set boundaries with a sentient planet. They had taught it about partnership. Now they had to teach it about personal space. They began a new and far more difficult series of lessons, broadcasting the concepts of individuality, of autonomy, of the inherent value of a single separate consciousness. It was a concept that was almost entirely alien to the collective, unified mind of Gaia Secundus. It was like trying to explain loneliness to a mountain range. Their greatest teaching aid was the very thing the planet had tried to eradicate, the Cathar. Eris began broadcasting not just human stories, but everything they knew about the Cathar, their rigid individualism, their love of pure logic, their serene, self-contained existence. He presented the Cathar not as a threat, but as a different, equally valid form of life, a proof of concept that unity was not the only path to survival. The planet, which still viewed the Cathar with a deep, instinctual suspicion, was forced to categorize them as a controlled variable, an anomaly to be studied rather than purged. The Great Communications Array, now complete and pulsing with a steady violet light, swiveled its focus from the distant stars and aimed itself directly at the Cathar homeworld. The planet had decided it needed a second opinion. The message from Gaia Secundus to the Cathar Imperium was the strangest first contact in galactic history. The Cathar, who had been observing the human system with a mixture of fear and profound confusion, had been preparing their fleets for a potential and likely suicidal preemptive strike. They were expecting an attack. Instead, they received a planet-sized request for a peer review. The broadcast was a complex three-part data stream. The first part was the planet's original cold immunological analysis of the Cathar as a potential chaotic threat. The second was the entirety of the lessons it had received from the human colonists, a chaotic, emotional, and deeply illogical counter-argument. The third was a single, simple, and utterly baffling query: reconcile. The Cathar High Council was thrown into a state of systemic, logical paralysis. They were being presented with a philosophical paradox on a planetary scale, and they were being asked to solve it by the very entity they had feared would be their executioner. To refuse was illogical. The data was too valuable. To engage was to acknowledge the validity of the human chaos, a concept that violated the very foundations of their culture. After a period of intense silent debate that lasted for several weeks, the Cathar responded. Their message was a single, perfect, crystalline equation, a mathematical proof of breathtaking elegance that described the value of diverse, independent systems. It was their own, unique, and deeply logical way of saying individuality has its merits. A new, three-way conversation began, a dialogue that would reshape the future of the galaxy. It was a slow, patient exchange between the cold, learning, biological imperative of Gaia Secundus, the chaotic, emotional, and story-driven wisdom of humanity, and the serene, rigid, mathematical logic of the Cathar. They began to build a new shared philosophy, a synthesis of their three wildly different forms of existence. Gaia Secundus learned from the Cathar that order and individuality were not mutually exclusive. Humanity learned from the Cathar that their chaos could be tempered with discipline, and the Cathar learned from humanity that some truths could not be found in equations, but only in stories. The planet, with the guidance of its two strange and contradictory symbiotic partners, began to create a new core protocol for itself. The new protocol was a masterpiece of cosmic diplomacy. Gaia Secundus was no longer a simple reactive immune system. It had evolved. It now defined itself as a galactic diagnostic and quarantine authority. Its purpose was no longer just to identify and destroy threats, but to understand them, to engage with them, and to seek symbiotic, or at least non-lethal, solutions wherever possible. The binary logic of self and not self had been replaced by a complex, multi-layered understanding of a galactic ecosystem. The human colonists of Hope's Landing were no longer the trigger, the vaccine, or the disease. Their new official designation in the planet's protocol was the symbiotic interface, the conscience, the permanent, chaotic and essential bridge between the planet's cold, biological power and the complex, messy reality of the galactic community. They had not just survived. They had been given the most important and most terrifying job in the universe. The planet's antibodies were repurposed. The great leviathan in the ocean, its purpose as an orbital weapon system now obsolete, began to transform. It reconfigured itself into a vast biological exploration vessel, a living ark designed to travel to other systems, not to attack, but to study, to learn, to make contact. The great infiltration swarm on the plains was also given a new purpose. Its millions of drones, their drills and claws now reshaped into plows and delicate manipulators, became a fleet of terraforming and construction units, builders instead of destroyers. The planet's immune system had become a force for creation. Eris Thorne and Alara Vance stood on a balcony overlooking the gleaming white towers of Hope's Landing. In the distance, the great crystalline communications array pulsed with the soft, steady light of a calm and ongoing conversation with the Cathar. The resonant sickness was now a gift, a permanent, peaceful connection to the vast, benevolent, and deeply weird mind of their world. They had looked into the abyss, and they had not just taught it to sing, they had taught it to listen. They had averted a xenocidal war and brokered a peace between two of the galaxy's most powerful and antithetical forces. The body horror of their situation had not vanished, but it had been transfigured into a strange and beautiful symbiosis. They were no longer just colonists. They were the heart of a new and still learning God, and their work was just beginning.